Welcome to Two Teachers and a Table. We are your hosts. This is Mr. Bergman, and I'm Mr. Ripka. Thank you for joining us today. Today our topic of discussion is Romanticism. And really I'd like to ask whether a romantic can ever even be happy. But before we get there, I would like to begin by asking Mr. Bergman if he can explain what the Enlightenment is, because I'm curious really if the Enlightenment had any influence on the Romantic period.
Well, the Enlightenment actually is a liberal academic movement that took place after the scientific revolution. And the whole idea with the Enlightenment, what you had was people who were using the principles of scientific experimentation and applying it to social principles as well. And so you had people looking into how do we apply the same reason we apply to science to our society, to our civilization, to our government, and how do we become better people as a result of that?
I have a question for you on this point. Do you think that's possible to use a scientific method on a society, which is essentially what sociology? Do you think that's possible, or are they abusing the scientific method?
No, personally, I don't think it's possible for the simple reason that when you're dealing with human beings, you always have the potential of dealing with an emotional element. Emotion doesn't exist in science, but it exists in every other aspect of human life. Unfortunately, even in government, where government is interesting if you look at it from an Enlightenment point of view, because if you have enlightened government, you have principles that deal with reason like that you use in science. However, can be an altruistic aspect of government or an altruistic expectation of government. Government may not respond emotionally, but there's people who will use emotions to push political platforms within government.
Like demagogues.
That it's exactly, which in science there is no place for emotion. If science enters an emotional realm, it's because science has entered politics.
I see.
In some way or another. If you look at a lot of sensitive political issues now, and they try to use science to defend that standing, they may use pathos to do that, but that's not using true reasoning. And you're right. That's that type of reasoning that we use in science will never completely permeate.
I like that because you're dealing with emotions essentially, and science, when you're analyzing nature and you're coming up with hypotheses and these things, you're trying to not be so subjective. And emotions can be subjective. I was thinking while you're talking that we hope also the courtroom is emotionless, right? That is, you go in there and you use reason. That seems like a coming out somewhat of the Enlightenment. I mean, the courtroom's old from ancient Greece.
The reason why justice is shown as blind, and of course they did borrow a lot from the ancients. These were very educated people who had classical educations. So obviously, yes, we see justice as blind. That's actually a Roman allegory. That justice is not based on the type of prejudice based on emotion.
And the Enlightenment, of course, had many philosophers in that movement. David Hume, if I remember correctly, Kant. I mean, you have a lot of these Enlightenment philosophers that are many of them are doing exactly what you're talking about, trying to use science to discuss human nature, like Hume, or trying to use science, perhaps like Hobbes, to discuss politics and things like that. So.
Very good, right. And I think it's that crossover, though, from science to just using the idea of reason and then coming up with just like in philosophy, when we use an argument, when we have to support an argument using reason, that's what they did. It was a thinking outside of the box, but defending it. Rousseau is probably one of the best examples of that.
As an enlightened person, really? Because I've always considered him a romantic. That is, Kant once said that I had to read Rousseau twice. The first time, it was so beautiful that I just nodded my head the whole time in agreement because the prose was so beautiful. The second time, I I wasn't swept away by the beauty of the prose, and I looked at the argument, and it was a horrible argument. I didn't agree with it at all. Right?
Well,
I mean,
right.
he's because of Rousseau's rhetoric, but maybe that doesn't have to do with his being a romantic per se. But
Well, and that's the thing. It doesn't, and when it crosses that line from reason into more emotion, it doesn't have to be a reasonable argument anymore.
True.
And it sounds like an argument. It has all the makings of an argument, but it's a paper argument.
Yeah.
It's not.
Which
It
doesn't
can't be
convince
substantiated.
doesn't convince that many people. I mean, it can convince people, but many times the emotions are more convincing.
Right, right. Well, yeah, and it depends on how the individual responds.
I think one I heard. I can't remember, it was Adler, I think, who said something like the government really is more afraid of that drunken poet than he is of the rational philosopher who's writing treatises, because the poet is the one that can rile up the mob, essentially, with the emotions.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the poet's job is to raise pathos.
So the Enlightenment had a focus on order, reason, rationality, progress.
Progress, definitely. Yes, and that's what made it a liberal movement.
Yeah, and underneath the progress, they thought through education and politics, you could progress.
Oh, and sociology.
And sociology.
You have to break down, the stereotypes of, and a social system where there was not equality is a big part of Enlightenment thinking.
What years would one consider? I know we can't really demarcate these.
Yeah, you're mostly
black,
17th through the 18th century. So you have your
16,
really earliest,
1700s.
right? You have your earliest thinkers that are coming right off of the scientific revolution from the 16th
Descartes, like right out of
century.
Descartes,
Right.
Newton, all those boys,
And all the way up to Locke,
All the
who's
way-
fairly,
okay.
the child,
Oh,
compared
yeah.
to others. Locke lived during the Glorious Revolution of the 1680s.
And Locke sometimes considered in the philosophical world as an empiricist, but it seems pretty closely related to reason and enlightenment.
Right.
I mean,
Exactly.
empirical inquiries are pretty much scientific inquiries.
Exactly.
Right. So having kind of given the definition of enlightenment, the next question, before we get to whether a romantic can ever be happy, which I'm curious about, the next question is there any connection between this movement you're talking about from the from 1600s, 1700s? Is there any connection with the Romantic movement? That did come after that, right?
Yes. Romantic movement is more associated with the 19th century
Okay.
than the.
So if we thought about it in a timeline, sorry to interrupt, but it'd be like 1600s, 1700s, kind of an Enlightenment somewhat period.
Yeah, the Enlightenment actually goes on to the 1780s, 90s.
Okay, late
Right.
1700s, and of course it's not overnight. Suddenly everybody's romantic or anything.
Right, and
Nothing
Romanticism
like
is, in the United States it would be post-Federalist, talking 1820s, 30s.
Oh, okay.
At 40, all the way up before in the United States, the antebellum period.
Who are the
Civil War.
Who are the American romantics? Literary figures.
The transcendentalists,
Hawthorne, Emerson,
that group. Yeah, Poe.
Poe.
Fits into that. It's Gothic horror, but it's definitely a romance. What you see is that period ends in the United States with the Civil War. The reality of the Civil War left no place for romanticism, which is idealistic.
Okay, I'm glad you said that because I'm curious if we can define, since we have defined the Enlightenment era, if we can't define romanticism too.
But I just have to say, while I'm thinking about it, the Civil War stops romanticism in the United States, so we get into a point of realism. However, the romanticism drove the Crimean War in England. When the English fought in that, the whole idea of them being in that war, despite the fact that they may have had access to cameras, or maybe it wasn't photographed as much as the American Civil War, which was a little bit, they're about contemporary. But what's interesting is the British still going into Crimea to fight, and including Byron, who went down with his fancy uniform and ended up getting dysentery and dying.
Isn't he an emblematic romantic figure?
Yeah, exactly. I go with my fancy uniform and my cause representing all the good things. And
He goes to a war with a
Right.
fancy uniform.
right, and that's not what whereas the Americans thought that, in the Civil War, and you see the paintings are romantic. And, they show, somebody brave on a horse that's been shot and falling down, and, the look on their faces, I'm giving up my life. And then you see the photographs of the reality of what the Civil War was, and that's not what it was like. A painting romanticizes it, the photograph.
But don't we use that negatively? Romanticize? We use this in a negative way in English. That is, I think you're romanticizing that moment in history. I think you're romanticizing something. And, I mean, maybe it's not always negative.
It depends on the time in which you live. If you live in a liberal time, romanticism is considered a good thing.
Isn't it?
Romanticism is considered being able to feel things or look at the higher cause, and not be that realistic. They won't let you get off. Romanticism creates poets and novelists and Disney characters and whatever. And you need that for their creativity. Obviously, romanticism, if a person's practical science-minded, then romanticism is frivolous and negative.
Alfred Whitehead, the philosopher, the English philosopher, he once said that, like, teachers, the first thing you do with a topic is romanticize it for your students. That is, you give them the romance of it because that gets them interested, and then you can go into the logos of the reason and the logic and the arguments and all that, because they've already been captured by the romance of it, like the story of it, and they're interested. Well, it seems like it sparks interest more than just starting with an argument or here are the dates, here's what we're doing. You can start somehow with a romantic depiction of whatever it is.
And you made a really good point there, because a lot of their history comes from media, the movies. They use sheer drama to create history. When I show some of these, like, to a world history class, and I'll show them excerpts of a video as presented by the romantic side of history. Martin Luther is a good example. The Lutheran Church approved a version of Martin Luther's biography, told in a narrative movie style, with the Fiends. What's his name? One of the Fiend brothers.
Ralph. Is it Ralph Fiennes or something?
The brother, one of the brothers, who played in Shakespeare in Love.
Oh yeah, I can't remember his name, but I know who you're talking about. Right. I thought it was Ralph, but it might be something else.
Yeah, and he plays Martin Luther, and of course it romanticizes Martin Luther's life. We know what Martin Luther was like. There's documents, that tell us. He said very negative things about the very peasants who were pushing him to the top and promoting him. He said extremely negative anti-Semitic remarks, and had no second thought about. What he said was completely uncharitable, unchristian. That's not shown in the movie.
I see.
So my students see that, and right away they. This is a 100% good person. And one of the things that I'd love to do is to list all the romantic things that you see in a movie, then list the real documents and say, was that person a hero or a villain? And then it's up to them to come to that conclusion.
Wow.
So, you can romanticize it or you can be realistic about it. Right. However, realistic doesn't have to be negative either.
Right.
Obviously, when you're looking at Martin Luther, you say, oh, well, he was anti-Semite, he treated he regarded the peasant, thought peasants should be murdered.
Wow.
And however, though, was what he did, total. Can you negate everything else that he did? And obviously, you don't have an argument for that.
Do the Romantics then, if I'm thinking of the Enlightenment and we have reason, what's the word we could use kind of to capture the idea of the Romantic? Is it imagination?
Romanticism? It's more or less a sentimentality.
I find that to be painful.
Yeah.
Personally.
Why? Give me an example.
Looking at old yearbooks sometimes is like I find like I'm getting sentimental and it's enjoyable, but I'm feeling pain also a little bit. I feel like it's not 100% pleasure when I feel sentimental.
Romance is supposed to be that way.
Is it?
Yes.
That's why I want to know if a romantic can be happy.
Romance encapsulates the fact that our pain drives us to do things. The starving artist.
That is romantic.
Right, exactly. If you are dying for love, the Spanish took their romanticism to that point. and which of course comes from old, Christianity, courtly manners
That
in
makes
Christianity,
sense.
dying for that which you love or hold dear. That right, the higher purpose is the longing for something, that knowing that something in the past was better than it is now, and you'll never get it back, and that longing is what they find in what a true romanticist finds enjoyable.
And that's what I find painful, is the longing. Because it's a sort of, you'll never get it. You're just longing for
So
it.
you
It's
never-
like an addiction or something, and you can't get the drug or something.
But you
You're
never
just
wanna,
always longing or something.
You never want to listen to a sad song?
Oh, I do, of course, because I'm a glutton for pain. I mean, of course I do, and I like sad songs more than happy songs. I like tragedies more than comedies. I like of course I do, but I still am aware that when I become more romantic or more sentimental, my fear is that I become sentimental to a sort of Hallmark way, and it's just like disgusting, and I want to
And you must have regrets.
maybe, I don't know. I'd have to think about it. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm a happy person. I like being happy, but
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, you're fine.
You don't have to defend your
no,
happiness.
no. I enjoy explaining.
You seem happy to me.
I'm pretty happy. I enjoy explaining myself. But yeah, I just is the romantic movement then, whether it's happy or sad, is it a reaction to the Enlightenment, in your opinion? And if not, is there any connection at all between these two?
I mean, generally, in the study of history, all time periods are related to one another, influence one another, or a revival that maybe came back differently. Generally speaking, the two are never linked. It's like the scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment are seriously linked because one borrowed from the other. Romanticism definitely wasn't new. It goes back to the idea of Eleanor of Aquitaine and courtly love, but puts it in a 19th century perspective.
I see.
And so it's sort of a revival, once again, of a type of liberalism. You really hear the liberalism in the music, like Beethoven. If you listen to the Fifth Symphony, it has that unstable beat that is more typical of Romanticism, the Baroque, which is very conservative and maintains a pattern. Romanticism goes outside of a pattern and looks for something.
Kind of like jazz, in that way, like jazz or something.
Yeah.
It's kind of playing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a little more free verse.
Is it fair to say that like the Romantics and that movement produce more poetry, songs, like music, paintings, artwork than the Enlightenment, which are producing more like philosophical treatises that are rational?
No, they each produce. I mean, they produce something very different, but they each produce, and not only that, but every country that picked up on the movement, whether it's the German states, France, England, had their own interpretation of that. It was going to be very Romanticism in Germany is very different from Romanticism in England.
That's true.
And in France, something different yet.
What connected them all then?
Well, it's not what connected them; it's what made them different. France, for instance, was always after the French Revolution that they had to deal with that. They're still dealing with it. France has never really settled down.
Did the revolution influence their romantic movement?
Yes, definitely. And I would say that Napoleon helped usher a lot of that in for the simple reason. Well, that's interesting you should say that because I was just thinking of the most famous artist of the French Revolution would be David. And of course he did the famous painting of Marat, dead in his tub. But that painting is done according to complete the principles of Greco-Roman reality.
I see.
And so, as far as an artist is concerned, you can see that Age of Reason. You take romantic art, or with the reason of, and when again, because of the revolution, believe it or not, the French Revolution represents the age of reason.
Really?
So it's
It almost sounds romantic, though,
yeah,
right?
well, they romanticized
that
it.
is the
once
lower
again.
class uprising.
Right, exactly.
Having like romantic ideals.
Right,
of
and that's
freedom.
probably where the revolution went wrong, because and a lot of the principles, as you know, by the Reign of Terror, were completely lost. And
Passion started ruling.
Right.
Exactly.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And then, so Romanticism tended to have been a response that, I don't know, in a way it picked up a sense of relaxation compared to the tense times that took place before it. That's the best that I can say. Like in Germany's Romanticism came about because it was trying to unify. And in unifying, it was trying to come up with a large national identity. How do you do that? You look back to your roots. What is it in our roots that gives us our identity? That's why so many people today are interested in finding out their DNA and where their families are from, because they're looking for an identity today. And so it's a romanticism to go back and imagine your ancestors, doing things that. They're like, let's say the majority of us, and despite the fact that I'm descended from Habsburgs, that I'm sure the majority of my family, were farmers. I'm sure of it. I know for a fact they were, and life was hard for them.
Well, Bergman is what is that German?
In Swedish. And they actually were copper mining engineers, which is how they got the name. Bergman wasn't really their name; they were given that name by the king. But my other side is Acadian.
Oh, nice.
And I know from the property that my Acadian ancestors owned up in Canada was farmland.
Okay.
And they were wealthy farmers, but they were farmers nonetheless. And their life was easy compared to other people during their time. But by today's standards,
I feel like a romantic could romanticize farming.
Yeah, well,
they can romanticize anything.
Oh yeah, anything.
I mean,
anything.
Like any past.
Yeah,
it can be.
Well, that's where we get the word pastoral. When we think of pastoral, we think of something beautiful from romantic, but it's farm. Yeah. Farms aren't. If you've ever worked on one, I worked on a farm in Kansas for 2 summers, and it's anything but romantic. It's hard work.
And it's funny because romantic comes from Roma, coming from Rome. So a lot of this is even hearkening way back to the ancients and romanticizing that because things were beautiful. When really that was probably the most severe time to be alive. Right? I mean, it was an interesting, burgeoning time, but really that's a dangerous time to be alive. Yeah. It's a little.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a lot less dangerous now.
Can I tell you the story while I'm thinking about it? And it always reminded me of what you're talking about. And I always want to tell people this story because it's amazing when you get to different milestones in your life where you actually have breakthroughs. Oh, nice. But I grew up just always I was always fascinated by the Great Plains, that you had this great open area with all this wheat growing in it. And I used to love looking at old Western scenes. And I love these ideas of plains and prairies. So I made it a goal when I was in college that I was going to go to Kansas, the heart of wheat country, and get a job. Somehow or other.
Oh, you have a romantic ideal of what was going to happen.
Yes, exactly. So the first time I went out, I visited and I stayed in one of the tiniest little towns in Gove County, a little town called Quinter. It has about 400 people, maybe that many. Wow. All related, they all know each other. And I was a visitor in town, so I was a big deal. And so one of the more prominent farmers and his wife came over. They were my parents' age. And they came over and they greeted me and invited me to dinner and whatever. And then so I went back, I visited Kansas all over and then went back home. The following summer, I got in touch with them. And they said, you want to see what it's really like out here? Why don't you come out and work with us? We could use the help. Yeah. So I went out, and I'll never forget the first trip out. I came back a second year and worked. Nice. But the first year I went out, I flew out, and I had to take a little tiny prop plane to get from Topeka out to where they live. And it was still another 40 minutes to get from the airport to their house. And I remember going over the farms and then them driving to their house and seeing the big swaths of straw and the bales and thinking, oh, how romantic, how beautiful. Then I did 2 months worth of hard work. I had to form those swans. I had to bale that hay. And yeah, they have machines that do it, and then when the machine doesn't do it right, you have to take it all out and you have to put it
Right.
together and go
No
over
fun.
it again. Right, and you're all scratched up with it. You know, I had allergies from the grasses and whatever, but I did it. But going back, them driving me back to the airport, I saw that same stuff and I said, somebody's got a lot of work to do. My whole impression changed. And as soon as I said it, the farmer's wife who was sitting in front of me said it at the exact same time.
Wow. Your first time you had come as a romantic, looking at it as this beautiful painting almost,
Yep.
and now you, having experienced it, you see it now totally different.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is hard work.
Yeah.
And I had fun doing it when I was young. I would not have wanted to do it for a living.
It would seem a tough life. Yeah. It's funny that like the shepherd life, the pastoral
Yes.
life is quite romantic.
I think
and
about
it's
Marie
romanticized.
Antoinette. You know, she had her little shepherd's cottage
Yeah,
on
exactly.
Versailles.
And it kind of reminds me a little bit of one of my favorite literary characters is Don Quixote, who seems to, I mean, he's way before the Romantic period traditionally, but he seems to be quite a romantic
Absolutely.
figure because he wants to be a knight,
Courtly love.
courtly love, totally romanticizing Dulcinea. And then in book 2, when he's defeated by the Knight of the Mirrors, he is told that you cannot be a knight for a year. You must go home now, right? And so he goes home and he's going to adhere to these rules. But he decides, well, for this year, I'm going to go be a shepherd then. So he really just kind of shifted over from like one romantic ideal, the being a knight in courtly love, into now the romanticism of being a shepherd.
Right.
And not much really changed. He could still write poetry, or he could still romanticize about certain things and all that.
And then
But-
eventually he dies because he can't become a knight.
and then this is the thing. Once he gives up his romantic idea, he's like, okay, you're right. I'm not Don Quixote. That's not my real name. This is my real name. I am a gentleman. I'm not a knight. He dies right after that. Almost like once he gave up the romantic ideal, he died.
Right. There's no reason in living.
That story, though, of course, Cervantes says his whole point of writing the book is to disabuse people of their enjoyment of these books on knights.
Right.
Like, that's his point. It seems like he's making a lot more points, many more points. One being perhaps romantic ideals keep us alive.
Right. Well, and what's really interesting, though, is it's satire. We're not supposed to look favorably on Don Quixote.
Right.
The whole idea is he believes in an archaic way of life that never really existed anyway.
It's true. Only
And-
literature.
Right. And the whole idea, that's why he dies, because he can't live in the real world. And Cervantes is a Renaissance Enlightenment. He's technically the Renaissance is the first Enlightenment.
That's a good point. It's a
Before
rebirth.
the Age of Enlightenment. They applied it different because the church was still in power. But you know, and Cervantes is using that Renaissance reality. So yeah, that's all.
What is it, just to continue on with this, what is it about nature that seems to attract romantics?
That's all. Well, nature. First of all, simplicity. It's what we are. Basically, we are an animal as well. We're one with nature. We're not. Technically, progress takes human beings who are nature and puts them outside of nature because we can improve upon nature. You know, we have heat in our house in the winter. We have air conditioning in our house in the summer nowadays. They were able to have fireplaces in the house, back in the old days.
Right.
And so it was that idea of getting back to nature is getting back to more what you really were, and honesty that progress didn't necessarily have. I mean, we have people, and they do it nowadays, or that idea, they even make fun of it again. There was that, it was a British sitcom back in the 80s, and I can't remember what it was called, but the family decided that they didn't want to do the 9 to 5 grind anymore.
Right.
And they couldn't afford to buy a farm, so they stayed in their house and in a neighborhood with a lot of homes in a suburban neighborhood and started a farm in their backyard. And, you know, it had animals, pigs, cows. I mean, not cows, but chickens, smaller animals. And the neighbors just sort of learned to deal with it. And it was that idea, you know, going back. The romantics, the hippie movement of the 70s is a romantic
It's
movement.
a romantic movement.
And it was the same thing, you know, getting back to nature.
Didn't the transcendentalists come together at one point and start a farm?
Yes, they did up in New Hampshire.
Up in New Hampshire, but it was a disaster because like they overly romanticized what would happen,
why they
and
were
then
there,
they realized I have to do a lot of work.
Yeah.
When am I going to have time to read and do my poetry and all these other things? And I think it didn't last that long.
Right, they wanted to be gentlemen farmers, and
Exactly.
like Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, and then they got the real world shock like you did when you went to Kansas.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, like,
Exactly.
whoa, I got to do work actually.
And it is hard work.
Yeah, it seems very hard. So just to make sure if we can kind of make some connections, is there a connection? I just want to make sure I got the answer between the Enlightenment and the Romantic movement, according to you.
Right. I mean, you can make a connection. Technically there's a little bit of a space sort of between the two. But like I said, any movement can influence a future movement, and any movement too. Nothing's new under the sun. All movements have come again and again and again. You know, when we talk about the Renaissance or the Romantic era or the Age of Reason, there's been other ages that are real similar in between that maybe weren't as big of movements or contained other things or were not as popular, but they always occurred. So everything borrows from everything else, and Romanticism certainly borrows from any principle that would define it in the first place.
Yeah.
And so if Enlightenment has any of those qualities, and any future movement that uses those qualities, you could say, yeah.
I can say I've always seen it, I guess, oversimplistically. That is, Enlightenment being reason, order, and Romanticism being emotion, chaos in a way. You know, I've almost kind of seen it as dichotomies.
Well, the thing is, too,
and it's probably overly simplifying to do that.
Well, it's the perspective, too, of the people who start the movement or, perpetuate the movement. The Age of Reason, when anybody was being emotional in the Age of Reason, they didn't perceive themselves as being that. They perceived themselves as being rational, completely rational. You have Pascal, who's probably a good example, again, of the Age of Reason. And, yet he was a deeply religious person.
And imaginative.
Right, exactly. And very much so.
That's what we talked about before with Descartes being very rational in him.
Right, exactly. Why Descartes used to look at Pascal like he's a kid who doesn't know anything yet.
Didn't you say he had a vacuum in his brain or something like that?
Exactly. Yeah, the only vacuum is the one in his brain. But it's how you perceive yourself in the movement that you're in. And if you, certainly the Age of Enlightenment, Robespierre, believed he was rational, and he was anything but rational.
And there is also that, how you perceive yourself, and then how others are kind of perceiving you. Exactly. I could perceive myself as a romantic, and someone else could be like, no, dude, you're totally rational, or something.
Right.
There's sort of
I think it tends
ways
to work the other way around. You're more likely to have somebody who wants to perceive themselves as rational being not rational than somebody who wants to perceive themselves as romantic, not actually being romantic.
Did we... maybe we can bring in Star Trek here, because I thought you had brought this up to me earlier. That is
the only Star Trek that I'm really familiar with.
Well, we're not going to... Only these two characters.
Yeah, they are.
Spock and Kirk.
Okay,
that's all we're talking
I'm familiar enough with
Those are the only two I know.
Mine is The Next Generation is the one I used to watch.
But I thought you had brought up that Spock is more sort of enlightened, rational...
because
maybe
they have to show
enlightenment, no emotion, really rational. Yeah. Kirk is very emotional, spontaneous, which is kind of romantic.
Right. Well, the show wanted to do that to create a juxtaposition, so there's a tension between
and
the
it kind of oversimplifies it, like I kind of have done in a way.
And then now and then they surprise each other because they each step out of that character.
That's a good point.
Certain episodes where, that's funny, you're supposed to be the rational one, and you were more emotional than I was. where'd that come from? And of course, we always know too that what Spock is actually doesn't he have a
He's a girlfriend, doesn't he?
yeah?
At
But
some
doesn't he have a isn't he only part?
Oh, I think you're right. His mother's side or
Yeah.
something like that. But I'm
Yeah,
getting
it's
this
human.
from a movie that I've only watched
Yeah,
once.
I'm not
5
sure.
years ago.
Yeah, I think he's part human and part what is he? A Vulcan.
Vulcan. Good job. Nice work. This guy
I was
can,
gonna say.
I like how Bergman can go from like Homer to Star Trek.
The thing is,
I mean, good job.
what I don't want to do is insult any Star Trek
No, of course
people who are
not.
watching.
Of course
I
not.
was gonna call him a Klingon, but
You would have insulted them then.
but I thought,
Yeah.
but I was rational.
I have one kind of final question. And it's probably not the final, but it's getting close to that. All right, this is my question for you. Who do you think then lives a happier life? A child of the Enlightenment or a child of the Romantic period?
I have to say, a child of the Romanticism.
Is a happier person. I've never heard of a hopeless enlightened person,
Mm-hmm.
but I've heard of a hopeless romantic.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, so the the thinkers of the Enlightenment constantly let themselves down, because, like you said, a person cannot be completely rational. And there was always a mark that they had set that they strive for, and they made changes as a result, but they never met it. And romanticism's easy.
It's easy?
It's easy to be romantic. It's easy to. All children are romantic.
Because
children.
they're imaginative?
Yeah, they have imagination. They have a sentimentality. They're the. If you step on a dandelion, you may not think twice about it, but a 3-year-old might be devastated. By seeing that.
And
happen.
so would William Wordsworth.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But maybe not Blake though. Blake
Probably
was
not
a little on
Blake.
the harsh side.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's I think romantics. Disney was a romantic. Romantics can get away with a lot. They can exhibit childlike behavior, and it's considered charming rather than immature or stupid.
Would they have ups and downs? They would have like moments of ecstasy, and then these like
Right, the
like
deep moments of
deep
depression.
depth, yeah,
And that's
profound
what they
moments of
need.
depression.
It's a certain bipolarism.
Almost like bipolar. Whereas the children, let's say, of the Enlightenment, are kind of even kill, right? Or at least attempting to be that.
And it depends.
Not stoic, but
Does a bipolar person enjoy their manic period? Some do. That's when they're the most creative.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, a lot of writers and all that we believe may have had, symptoms of any kind of bipolar disorder, did their most creative work when they were in their manic stages.
Yeah.
Edgar Allan
Artists.
Poe, Mark Twain.
Yeah. Mark Twain too.
Yeah, definitely.
We had 2 names.
Yeah, and Mark Twain. What's interesting about Mark Twain is his wife, in writing about his behavior, and he fits into that idea. Yeah, Mark Twain's considered a realist writer, or one of the first realists, but he wrote a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. That's romantic and having fun with it, because the rational thinker, the scientist, has gone back to the Middle Ages, that believes in myths and magic, and the two worlds, collide. And Mark Twain's wife, though, she wrote about him and his behavior, or people wrote about how she responded to his behavior. And she loved him, and she dealt with a lot of things that usually a parent would have to deal with from a child. And she called him youth.
Really?
That was her nickname for him, all the time that she was alive. She died and he lived many more years after that. But, she would just reprimand him or deal with him like you would deal with a teenage child. And then he would just laugh it off.
It kind of sounds like what we're saying is that a romantic is like a child, an enlightened person is like an adult who has reason and can be rational about something. And yet we're saying, and I guess it's almost romantic in a way to say that the children have better lives than adults. Like they're free from work
Right.
and free from a
Well,
lot
they
of
don't
the
know
cares,
any
and
better,
they don't
right.
know any better.
Or they're not expected.
And they're not yeah, exactly. But it's an interesting way to think about it, as opposed to like Spock and our other man there, Kirk, Captain Kirk. You can also think of like a child. Oh, well, I guess it would be an adult because Spock, and then a child with Captain Kirk in a way.
Yeah.
That is that you have really rationality going on, and then you have emotion going
Right.
on. But you really do think that the romantic would live a happier life
Oh, definitely,
in
yeah.
the Enlightenment, and not just like moments of bliss, but overall.
Overall,
happier
yeah. I
life.
mean, what could be better than looking at something and saying it's something better than what it is, or looking at your past and only remembering the good stuff? That's what romantics do.
I like that idea. I do like that. That is, and the memory kind of works like that. Like you get out of like maybe a bad relationship, and then 5 years later, you just remember the good things.
Right. Well,
Or
and that's the thing too.
something.
And I'm glad you mentioned about relationship because we used the word romance, when and a couple dating or whatever. But at that time, they're not seeing each other for what they really are. They're seeing each other for what they believe they are. And we all know if you've been in a relationship for a very long time, eventually you start to see. You don't start to see that real person has revealed themselves over the year, and you don't regard them the same way you did as when you were first in romantic love with them.
I think that's why like most parents recommend you date somebody for a long period of
Right,
time before you
exactly,
marry
to get
them,
over that
to get over that initial
limerence or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes.
But
makes
I
sense.
mean, I know myself. When I was a teenager, 17. I mean, now in those days I wouldn't have said I was romantic, but now when I look back at it, it's a lot of drama. Because things meant so much to me that now, I don't. They don't. All these years later, you have a different set of values, or you perceive it differently.
Yeah.
So I become more rational.
I think that's
And that's
almost
interesting too because it was I'm trying to remember the enlightened thinker that basically it was it's Kant.
normal.
Immanuel
Oh, okay.
Kant.
Emmanuel. Yeah.
And he said that enlightenment is social and personal maturity.
He sure did. He wrote that essay, "What is Enlightenment?"
Yeah.
And he said, "Dare to know, dare to understand."
Yeah.
That was his main.
But that idea that if you're not enlightened, you're immature. You're like a child. You're immature. You don't know better. I when I try to teach it to my students, and I tell them that it's a romantic notion as a child to believe in Santa Claus, but after a certain time, you rationalize. He can't deliver. There can't be one person to deliver his presence around the entire world on an entire night when there is no entire night.
Right.
At one time. And with one slayer, however they believe is bringing them gifts, because they come to the rational reason as to why, and that's when you grow up. Peter Pan is an example.
Yeah.
Peter Pan stays in that romantic world with, all the fantasy things, and crocodiles with, clocks in them, and pirates and Indians and
It's very romantic. Yeah.
right. And when Wendy can no longer go back after she reaches a certain age because she lives in the rational real world.
Well, I mean, the month of February is coming up here too, so we have Valentine's Day coming up. And love is in the air.
And you're allowed to be romantic that
So
time.
why would we say, just to kind of wrap this up, when a gentleman opens the door for a lady, wow, you're a romantic, aren't you? Why is opening a door considered romantic in the way that how is that even connected
Goes back again
to the movement that we're talking
courtly
about?
love.
Is it? It goes back
where
to
we
courtly?
get the word courteous.
Oh.
Meaning matters of the court.
So you have an ideal of how you should treat
Right.
a woman or a person.
And courtly love came back mostly in Victorian days as the Romantics. The Romantics were the Victorians, there's no doubt about it. And you could talk about the architecture and everything, a lot of frivolous, ornate ornamentation looking back. Gothic. The Gothic revival came about during that time, again, looking back to that romantic thing that Gothic is. And, that it's not. And, right, it's the same thing. And courtly love, they revived that again. And that's where it came from. Where the gentleman should be like a knight. And this is how a knight treats his lady.
Is it possible to have a third option? That is, you somehow are both a romantic and an enlightened
That's what hopefully we
figure.
all are.
Is
I would call that a balanced person.
a balanced person. A human
right.
being being a human being.
Yeah, if a real human being doesn't have an ounce of romanticism, where's the creativity? Compassion comes out of romanticism.
Right. You're right, sympathy.
Right, it can't come out of rational. I mean, we know it as teachers. We're there to educate people. We look at that as the total rational. We would never tolerate a second mistake.
That's, that's,
You know,
you have to have sympathy.
Yeah, and you know, if you look at things totally rational, and it's like, I'm sorry, this is what, this number is your grade, and blah blah blah, and you're not willing to work with that. Then it's like, you fell within this range, that was your chance. Bye. We don't do that as teachers, because of a certain amount of,
So in a way, we could conclude from our conversation that Romanticism is perhaps to give your conclusion, a happier, perhaps even better life than to be purely enlightened.
Mm-hmm.
But the best life is to learn the balance
Absolutely.
between when to be romantic, when to be enlightened.
Mm-hmm.
Because we need to have sympathy for others, but we need to be rational in certain cases and stuff like that. And perhaps, this is the struggle or the difficulty of life, is learning how to act in that particular situation at that particular time, whether to act emotionally, whether to act rationally.
Exactly. And if romanticism is part of your childhood, as you grow up and become more rational, you don't want to completely, you don't ever want to completely lose that.
I like that.
That romanticism.
Because then you'll completely lose perhaps connections with others.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
And with
if you
that,
don't want to be a Spock.
unless you want to be a Spock. Excellent. And with that, we'll go ahead and close up this episode. Thank you for joining us today for Two Teachers and a Table, and we hope to see you next week.